This video is designed to introduce you to my new Heavenly Heels socks. The book is available on my website and on Ravelry. It has sizes for everybody and gauges for every machine. Lots of variations are offered within the book, but all are constructed using the exact same approach shown here for infants. Here are some of the samples I made while designing the Heavenly Heels sock patterns. The book contains sizes for everyone from newborns through extra large adults and gauges suitable to all machines. And there are a lot of variations about what you can do with the kind of sock top, contrasting or non-contrasting heels, toes, and soles, and various other details. What makes them all unified is the style of heel, and even here there's some variation. That one has ribbing on the heel, that one does not. That one does not. So you can alter the fit a little bit by choosing to rib or not to rib. There is another unribbed one. Usually we don't need it. I'll be using yarn that gets 5 stitches and 6.5 rows per inch, which is common in light worsted weight yarn adjusted for socks on either the mid-gauge or bulky. But I do show you how to adjust your pattern if the gauge is slightly different in the yarn you get in the book. However, for the purposes of demonstration, we're going to assume that you're getting the same gauge I am. The infant sock pattern begins for bulky and mid-gauge machines using a suitable yarn that gets 5 stitches per inch by casting on 9 stitches. E-wrap is fine, especially if we're going to use the hung hem for a cuff, which is what I'm going to do. So I've cast on 9. I'm letting them knit back from hold because that's easiest. I'll do that for a couple rows. Then use weights or not as works best for your machine. These 2 rows do count, and I want 16 rows in total, so 14 more. Now lift the initial E-wraps and we'll hang them on the working needles. This finishes the cuff. If you want contrasting heels, change your yarn color now. If not, just keep on working with the same yarn and we'll go on and shape the heels. I'm going to finish this cuff by bringing the needles all the way forward. The carriage is set on in. Now it's closed and we can move on to the heel, but there's a nice complete stitch on every needle. You may use any sock top on this pattern, but we'll be using this one, the hung hem. Now it's your choice whether or not to use a weight. You know your machine. I'm using one of the ones that I show you how to make in my Cheap Tricks and Cool Tools book. It's also your choice whether you want to use the bobby pin method so as to make sewing as you go easy, or just increase, knit, and later seam, or you can sew as you go without bobby pins if you're good at that. But we're going to make increases until 8 increases have been completed in total. So we're going to do that by every row, moving out the outer stitch and picking up the purl bump from the row below. I'm using the next stitch in towards the bulk of the work rather than the one over here, because I've found that it's easier to get a hold of and be consistent with, but it's okay to use the other if you prefer it. So the increase is complete. On the carriage side only, we're going to hang this bobby pin on the working yarn, snug it up I'm going to knit back from whole just because it adds a layer of security. Knit across. This row we won't increase, but we will hang a bobby pin so as to create a sew as you go handle if you're using that method, and knit across. Now we increase again. The number of increases is going to end up being the same as the number of rows knitted, since we're increasing every other row. It's just that we're doing it in such a way that they'll be symmetrical, not just created on the carriage side, which is slightly asymmetrical. And hanging the bobby pins to create sew-as-you-go handles is a separate part of the process. Knit across, hang the pin, knit across, increase again. This will make a total of 6 increases. Find that purl bump, lift it, hang it. Same on the other side. Sometimes they want to be naughty, but we can always find them. Bring forward the needles, which is also optional, but I think knitting back from hold makes it easier to keep those bobby pins out of the business end of the carriage. However, as you see, it is possible to do it either way. One more increase. And let's stop and double check our count. We started with 9 stitches. We've increased by 8 stitches. That should give us 17 by my count. Always best to stop and check that here. Yes, all is well. Hang pin, knit across, hang a pin, and knit across. This is what we have. And we're done with the first part of the heel shaping. At this point we need to snip the yarn or break it, and I'm going to leave a long enough yarn tail to use for part of the seaming later. Now we need to set the carriage to hold because we're going to remove some of the stitches. I actually normally do that on this kind of circular needle, but I think you may be able to see what I'm doing better if I scrap off the stitches that need removing. So we're going to scrap off a group of 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the left. Just need a little flap of yarn to hold them. That should be enough. So I can break the yarn and let these drop off. They're safely held. And put these 6 back into work and scrap them off in the same way. No specific number of rows, just enough to give you a little flap so that you can control these stitches and then drop them off. There we go. Now we have 5 stitches remaining. I'm going to move my carriage back to the right because I would rather begin here, and it's only on the left from using the scrap yarn. Now again, on every size and gauge you will end up with a different number of stitches here, but in every case you now move the edge one in to the next needle over. So in this size we end up with only 5 needles and now 3 after moving the edge ones in. Here's the part that makes this pattern unlike any other that I know of. We now knit across on one row, lift the first held stitch from the waste yarn and hang it on the edge needle that's in work. Also, lift the next one and use it to increase. And don't let your working yarn get stuck on the needle that you're adding. We'll do the same thing on both sides. So here is my first held stitch. Lift it to the edge needle. Second held stitch. New needle. And knit across. Repeating the same process, make sure that you do find the very next stitch. Don't skip any. There it is. Lift it, hang it on the edge needle. Next one goes next door. Same on the other side. I've experimented on this about where exactly the working yarn should go. Should I hang the stitch over it or behind it? And I've decided I don't really care. So try it both ways and see what you like. I have decided it is unwise to let it hang up in the needle hook, as we already discussed. And we should have enough stitches here to do this one more time. The effect of what we're doing here is much like what is achieved with a hand-knitted flap and gusset sock. It's not identical, and it's definitely approached in a different way so as to take advantage of what the machine does well and not make ourselves crazy trying to reach things that are nearly impossible to reach on the machine. Hand knitting and machine knitting are making the same kind of stitches and doing the same job, but because the tools are so different, we can find that sometimes the approach cannot be the same. Now, we should be back to the same number of stitches that we had. That is, that we had upon casting on and beginning. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All is well. Here comes the easy part. We're going to resume hanging bobby pins, if using that method, for 12 rows, or just knit 12 rows. But there are no increases or decreases. I did a few rows off camera, just hung the 12th pin, and here we go across. Okay, that's the bottom of the foot. And if you wanted a contrasting bottom of the foot, you would have knitted these last 12 rows in, say, red. Had you also wanted contrasting heels, you would have started right below the cuff where we were working the increases and made that color change. Now it's time to knit the toe. I have two options written into the pattern, and I'm going to use the short rowed one, but there's also a decreased one for those who despise short rowed toes, and they come out exactly the same. You may use any method of short rowing you like, but I have found this works especially well. Make sure the carriage is set to hold, knit across, place one and hold, knit across, place one and hold. That's the first two rows. Now I'm going to move my weight. This is actually why people hate short rowing, because if you don't keep the weights just in the right place, in this case up into the center, these stitches won't knit off. They'll pop off instead of pulling down and doing what you want them to do. This is a combination of two methods of short rowing that I'm using. As I said, it's optional. Automatic short row means putting the needle in the hold after you've already knitted the row, and it's an automatic short row because it's automatically now going to wrap the needle that just knitted. However, I'm also wrapping the previous needle because I found something surprising happens in this pattern when you do it. Knit across, bring forward, wrap, knit across, bring forward, wrap, knit across, bring forward, wrap. Having done both a manual and an automatic wrap, I have found that I can now knit back without any kind of attention and still avoid holes. Now in some yarns, in some patterns, you don't need to do anything on the trip back in, even if you only did one kind of wrap. But I was getting holes, and I started doing that, and I wasn't getting holes, and I find it easier to do both kinds of wrap on the way out than to do one on the way out and one on the way in. It's simply because as we're returning these needles to work, it gets more and more complicated to keep the stitches knitting off. In this way, I could keep my thumb and forefinger pulling down to help the weight and position the pressure just right, and as you saw, no trouble at all. At this point, you may want to remove your weight. I took mine off. We want to look down our row of bobby pins, if using them, and find out which was the very most recent one hung, which was this one. So I will use it as a handle to lift the stitch, hang it on the edge needle, and knit across. And we'll do that all across. Now be careful. We're concerning ourselves with whichever pin is next in line, not so much with whether it's on the right or the left, but they have to alternate because that's how we put them in. And they pop up and show themselves pretty obviously, and they're easy to slide out and set aside and save for the next time. We're about to finish what was the sole of the foot. I think I got that one hung with a twist in it, but I'm going to leave it because this is just a sample, and that way you can get a look at what happens. Now we know where the change to the heel shaping occurs because we can see the waste yarn popping up there. But we don't actually do anything different because at this point we are knitting. Let's see if I can show it to you. Oh goody, look. This is the sole of the foot. This is the narrow point of the heel. And now we're about to start hanging the areas where we were increasing stitches to create the heel gusset and wedge shape. So we just basically keep on doing exactly what we've been doing. You can see there's a yarn tail from the waste yarn sort of in the way, but it really won't matter. Just ignore it. Keep it out of the way to the extent that you can, because we can pull it out later without a problem. So we finished knitting the part of the sock that goes up the top of the foot, along the top of the foot, from the toe to the ankle. And now we're actually working on what will be the front of the ankle. got a little glare keeping me from seeing that needle. There we go. Third from the last one. Second to the last one. And here we go, hanging the last one. Now, we've already got basically the sock done, but we only have a back cuff. And of course, we desire the sock to have a front cuff too. So we'll use a separate piece of yarn, and I'm going to do it with a contrasting yarn. We're going to E-wrap. What I really recommend you do is use a yarn that contrasts only slightly, so there will be no show through. But what I'm doing for you is something that contrasts a little bit more, so you can see it easily, and also because it's sitting right here handy. Now we'll just knit our 16 cuff rows. Whoops. And 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, of course, if you had decided on ribbing, you would have changed to ribbing instead of what you just saw me do. And if you had decided on a rolled top, you would have just knitted your rows. But since we decided for this sock to do a hung hem, here's how to get it hung on the second end of the fabric. And now we'll just bind off. By the way, while I bind off, let me explain to you what a hung hem is good for in a sock, because it actually is, although it's not the first choice in many instances. I missed my edge stitch, that's what I'm aiming at here. It's great for babies because they don't really have narrow ankles. So while you might have an ankle that tapers in sharply from your foot, very few newborns do. It's also great for casual, great for people whose feet swell, great for people who cannot, for one reason or another, stand any pressure. I'm removing the carriage to improve the lighting. So I'm binding off with the transfer method. If I were on a machine with gate pegs, I could certainly bind off around the gate pegs. You do want to remember that this bind off is going to need to stretch over a person's foot, so you need to balance neatness, which is always important, with stretch. Don't make it too tight. Whatever you choose. You could also backstitch bind off. It really doesn't matter. Use the one that you like, that looks good to you and is comfortable. It won't really show unless it somehow distorts the top of the sock, and you wouldn't want to bind off that did that. But this is going to be inside the sock. I'm going to break the yarn, leaving enough tail to use as part of the seam. So at this point, here's what we have, a sock with wings. But it's no problem at all to remove those wings. One out, two out. Now this side looks fine. This side looks terrible. That's because there's a yarn tail in there. Remember, we had to break the yarn at the end of the heel. So here you'll just want to take this. I'll have a spare needle here. And secure the yarn with whatever is your favorite method. This is a baby sock, and babies don't walk, so I felt free to actually knot the yarn, because babies do get their clothes washed very, very often. and we don't want anything to come loose. The reason not to use a true knot on a sock where someone will be walking is that it can irritate the foot. Now that untidiness is all gone. There's the heel all cleaned up. Here's what the side seam looks like with a nicely done sew as you go. There is a place where I must have not gotten my stitch hung the same direction, because you can see it makes a bump where there's not a bump elsewhere. The toe, one side of it looks nicer than the other for this reason, because I've already done this, stretching one direction and then stretching the other to set those stitches, because they were held and that can make them bump out. But here they have smoothed. Now all we have to do is seam our cuff together. That will be true whatever style of cuff you used. When I do a hung hem such as this one, I like to do the layers separately. And here's one approach. You may use any seam that suits you. But what you're seeing is me whip stitching the edge stitches of the inner layer together, because it won't be seen, and anything neat and flexible will work. And then I can spend my effort making a really pretty seam down here. I've tried all sorts, and I describe several in the book. For the purposes of this demo, I'm coming up through the edge of each stitch, or each side of the work. That one's already been worked into, and letting that be the seam. Unless you change the pattern a little bit, and I do show you a way to do it if it's going to bother you. But stitches are going one direction on the front of the cuff and the other on the back of the cuff, because we knit one from the top down and one from the bottom up in this design. You can arrange to do it differently, but some traditional seams won't align quite as you expected if you do that. However, this is fine with me, and I have never heard an infant complain about it. However, if it's not fine with you, this is actually where we started, but on the inside. And what you would do is start on waste yarn and skip the cuff for the sole of the foot. Then you would follow my instructions down through the heel, down through the sole of the foot, the toe, up the top, and up the front of the ankle that corresponds to the back of the heel. And then you would do the cuff exactly as I showed you on the front. At that point you would rehang your waste yarn, which is here, and do another cuff exactly like the front cuff on the back stitches. In that way, all of the stitches would face the same direction. So if it's going to bother you that it is one direction rows matching to another direction of rows, there is a solution. And here's why I think this fits so well, and in this particular yarn, it shows up well even on this small size. It generally shows up better on adult sizes. We did these increases, hanging bobby pins in this case. And then remember how we worked the increases back in two at a time, one hanging on an existing stitch and the other causing an increase? That creates this somewhat curved shape of a heel. It's not just a squared off addition popping out from the sock. There are multiple dimensions represented here. And I find that it's a great and nice, comfortable fit without doing some of the things that I have found so difficult trying to directly translate hand knitting patterns. However, if it's not fine with you, this is actually where we started, but on the inside. And what you would do is start on waste yarn and skip the cuff for the sole of the foot. Then you would follow my instructions down through the heel, down through the sole of the foot, the toe, up the top, and up the front of the ankle that corresponds to the back of the heel. And then you would do the cuff exactly as I showed you on the front. At that point, you would rehang your waist yarn, which is here, and do another cuff exactly like the front cuff on the back stitches. In that way, all of the stitches would face the same direction. So if it's going to bother you that it is one direction rows matching to another direction of rows, there is a solution.